Hello and welcome to this video tutorial which is titled Assignment Guidelines. For those of you who don't know who I am Trevelyn DeVette and I am the lecturer for the Musgrave campus. My intention in creating this video tutorial was to bridge the divide that we currently are experiencing because of social distancing and the lockdown, and also I wanted to provide an opportunity and a space for us to engage with a lot of these questions and concerns that many of you have raised. And when I say many of you have raised, this is particularly obviously my Musgrave campus students, and I really wanted to provide a space to engage with each one of you rather than doing it on an individual basis. So I'm going to be upfront that often I find it quite uncomfortable to attach a video here. There is something about seeing one's expression and hearing one's voice that makes you feel quite self-conscious. But I did think that I would put my feelings aside and connect with you in this way. I think we are very blessed to be in a time where we have technology at our disposal that we can bridge the very real gap and divide between each one of us. So I thought that I would utilize this. Just want to apologize up front. I've realized in this time that I have a very expressive face and my voice sounds very different in a recording to how it is in my head. But I guess that's just, human condition, and we all have that feeling at some point or another. I would like you to see this session as a consolidation and extension of the assessment guide. Please do not see it as a replacement for the assessment guide. Please use the assessment guide as your primary source. When we were creating it, we were very specific about the steps and instructions, so please follow that. My hope is that I will unpack the expectations that we have as markers for this particular assignment and just basically talk around what we expect from you. This assignment is obviously very creative in nature, and each one of you will create a very different assignment based on the poems that you select and your interpretation of the various quotes. So please see this as an independent activity, and please see this as a space for you to be creative and to read a bunch of really wonderful poems and really for you to create something that's quite meaningful. So I think particularly in this lockdown time, if you are feeling quite anxious and immobilized to get work done, I really want you to try see poetry and literature as a safe space to project your fears on, as a safe space to explore a lot of the emotions and uncomfortable emotions that many of us might be going through in a very safe environment. So use this time to read, and I think that the heart of this assignment is actually in reading around poems and finding poems that particularly speak to you, that you can then integrate into your future classrooms in a very meaningful way. So as much as this assignment is obviously hypothetical, because many of you won't necessarily be doing this in the classroom, although of course you can, I really want you to think of it as a practice for the classroom space. So one day as a teacher, I really want you to see poetry as providing this safe space, this encouraging academic space as well for children to engage with new ideas and engage and explore their emotions. So that's really our vision in creating this assignment, and which is why we have very open-ended themes that will be largely dependent on your interpretation. So I'd like to encourage you to really give this assignment your all, to make this assignment very meaningful, very relevant. This can really be an assignment that you do very well in, and we really just want to see your enthusiasm and your vision as a future teacher shine through. And I think if anything that this pandemic has taught us, it's that teachers are an invaluable part of society. In actual fact, for many families, teachers provide a safe space for their children to let out their energy, and they are now realizing how difficult it truly is to be a teacher. So bearing this in mind, I really want you to remind yourself of this awesome responsibility that you've undertaken, and I want you to really use this time to plan and to think ahead. So I'm hoping, I'm going to stop my rambling now, but I really just wanted you to think of these kind of things as you approach this assignment task. So I think it goes without saying that the learning outcomes of this task is to outline the expectation of the assignment, and obviously to provide you with some sort of overview of the expectation that we as markers are going to have. After the session, you might have more questions. A lot of the things that I'm maybe going to discuss, perhaps it encourages you to reflect on something and you'd like to pose a particular question. I'd like to ask you to please post questions in the assignment forum, and I am going to be in charge of the Musgrave assignment forum because as the sort of overseer of the marking process, I do want to explain what my expectations are, and I don't want to obviously speak for my other colleagues. So please post your queries that you might have. There will be campus-related forums, so each group will have its own forum, so please post your questions there and then allow the lecturer that is responsible for you to respond to those questions. I'd ask you please to do this because it's much easier to respond to you on a group basis rather than on an individual one-to-one basis. Also, you are more than welcome to help and assist one another, so see these forums as a space for you to also engage with one another. And then before you post a question or want to email a question to your lecturer, I'd like to encourage you to go and post them on the various forums because perhaps this question has already been asked and already been responded to by the lecturer. So please use these spaces to engage with one another. For the rest of the session, I have removed the video camera function as I would like to just focus on a lot of the points that I am going to raise. Please note that these instructions, if you have a feeling of déjà vu, and I'm hoping you do have that feeling of déjà vu, it's because most of these instructions come directly from your assessment guide. So I am just going to speak around it. I will not be reading through every single point, but I will just be adding to the expectation that we as markers have. So firstly, I thought of just providing a very general overview, and then we will be speaking around each one of the steps and requirements of the assignment. So firstly, I think we all know by now that you are expected to select a variety of poems around a particular theme. So be very mindful of the poems that you select. We will be expecting quality poems, and as much as a quality poem can be seen as something that's very subjective and up to the individual, it's very important that you are mindful of the poems that you select. Think about how do the poems relate to the theme in an interesting way. So obviously the selection of poems will depend greatly on your interpretation of the particular theme, but I really want you to take your time with reading a wide variety of poems and choosing poems that really speak to you, or choosing poems that you can see explores a particular theme, message, or would link very nicely to a lesson. This is really the heart of the assignment, and I'd really like to encourage you to take your time. So this first sort of part of the assignment should be a very enjoyable experience. We are reading through quite a lot of poems, and like I've already said, I really do see poetry as being our armor in these really anxious times. So read through a wide variety of poems and choose something that really speaks to you or something that you see as a really good platform for a particular lesson or particular learning activity. So obviously it goes without saying that it's very important for you to interpret the various themes, and obviously, like I've already said, to read a wide variety of poems. Okay, then these two steps, obviously the interpretation of the theme and the selection of poems, are quite interlinked. The next kind of step or phase of the assignment will be that you will be required to analyze the poems and then discuss the various teaching lessons that you will build around the poems. We are going to be quite strict about marking the analysis of the poems. Please do not just copy and paste information from the internet. It should be your personal understanding and interpretation of the poem. So think of the theme of the poem, think of the lesson of the poem, the language that is used, all of these things, and how it contributes to the overall enjoyment of poems. And be mindful that you don't put too much information in this analysis. Remember that you should be guided by the marking breakdown of each of the various assessment standards as explained in the marking rubric. Okay, so for this, we do want to encourage you to be creative. See this as a nice creative space where you can really explore, but please be very realistic about your learning outcomes and lesson planning ideas. I think a lot of the times what we do is sometimes we just put things down without really thinking about, are we thinking of South African space that we will obviously be teaching one day within, well, most of us will be teaching one day within, and be realistic about that. I think sometimes, you know, students tend to just put ideas down without thinking, is this achievable? So I don't want to restrain your creativity, but I also want you to be realistic in thinking, is this an achievable activity? So just for example, I remember last year many students were talking about how they'd like to create puppets in the classroom because they felt that this linked very nicely with poetry. But think about, is every foundation phase child able to create his or her own puppet? And is this something that's realistic and achievable? So let these kind of pointers guide your responses. So as we have already mentioned, selecting a theme will be obviously dependent on your interpretation of the various quotes. So just to explain the rationale in choosing these quotes, these are all quotes from very famous literature, particularly those that are classified as children's literature. But obviously this is literature that's still appreciated and enjoyed by adults. So I thought it would be a really nice introduction or foundation for the next unit, which will be on children's literature. But each one of these quotes, so they do come from literature, as I've already said, but the interpretation of it is very open-ended, so you can interpret it how you want. And that will actually be very important. So the interpretation of your theme and the poems that you select will be dependent on how you understand the particular quote and the particular ideas and values that are expressed and explored. So take your time with this. I think particularly in this lockdown period, this extended recess period that you now have, use this time wisely to read for pleasure, read for enjoyment, and I'm really hoping that you are starting to see poetry as an enjoyable space, as a space to express and project your emotions, as I have already said. Step 2 requires you to select a variety of poems that relate to your interpretation of the theme. You will be required to select 3 poems based on your personal interpretation of the theme or quote. So think of how the poems you select relate to the ideas or values as explored in the quote. And really what we're just wanting to see here is your creativity. So do you believe that this relates indirectly to the poem, or does it relate directly? We are going to be looking at your understanding and exploration thereof. Please be mindful that when you do select your poems, this is really the heart of the assignment. So don't leave this to the last minute and just select any old poems that you haven't read through yourself and interrogated. Take the time to read a wide variety of poems. And really that was our intention in our lectures, to read through and interrogate and encounter a wide variety of poems that explores a wide variety of morals and themes and ideas. So as much as part of the assignment requirement is that you do not select poems that we have encountered in lectures, you can use the poems that we've encountered in lectures as an inspiration or as a starting point for the kind of poems that really speak to you, that you are perhaps particularly passionate about, or perhaps there was a particular poem that has really stuck with you. Use this as a starting point and think about looking for poems that remind you of those poems or deal with similar ideas. Also, as much as we've already said, you will not be allowed to utilize any poems that we've encountered in lectures. This doesn't mean that you can't use the same poets. So if there was one particular poem that you, like I said, really spoke to you, look at the poet and maybe read around that poet, because there might be another poet that's written in a very similar way to that particular poet, or perhaps there's another poem by that poet. Either way, the options are endless, but I really want you to be very mindful and take your time with the step 1 and step 2. This is really the heart of the assignment, and will really kind of signify whether you will pass or fail the assignment. If you choose poems that are very low quality, that are not age appropriate, that are very infantile or immature, and don't really stretch the foundation phase children that you will be teaching, then you will be severely penalized, because it really indicates that you have not taken time to engage with this in a very meaningful way. So I don't want to say this as a threat, but it's just a reminder to just take your time. Make this something that is enjoyable. We've really created this assignment, and the thinking about this assignment was to really get you to rethink poetry, for you to insert yourself into poetry and to select teaching activities that really relate to you on quite a personal level, that you have planned for, and that you really spent the time thinking about the lesson, thinking about what you want to teach the class, and then obviously integrating it with something like poetry. Step 3 requires that you analyze each of the selected poems. And I think I just want to correct a misconception that we have here about the analysis of a poem. It is not sufficient to just identify the poetic devices. This does not constitute as an analysis. In order to analyze a poem, you need to consider how each of the elements all work together, or all work holistically to tell a story or to convey a specific emotion. So it's very important that you explore rather than just identify the elements of the poem. So think about things like the language of the poem, the actual words that the poet has chosen. Obviously under language comes rhyme and rhythm. How does this contribute to the feel, to the atmosphere and emotion of the poem? Then also very important to think about, what is this poem actually saying? Is there a moral message? Is there a theme? Is there an idea? What is actually being explored? And to kind of think about, how does this poem speak to you? So I think it's very important when you are encountering a poem, read it out loud, hear the musical qualities of the poem, and think about what emotion does this poem resonate in you? How does this poem make you feel? And your initial response to that will generally be, well, it either makes me feel happy or sad. And then I want you to dig a little deeper and think, well, why does it make me feel this way? And really, when you're responding to these questions, you are already starting with a very good analysis of a poem. So be mindful of this and look at the poem as a whole. Don't look at each one of the elements individually. I want you to think of the poem as the whole. Yes, it's important for you to discuss the poetic features and poetic devices, but I want you to keep coming back to how does this create some kind of an atmosphere, feeling, or emotion in the poem. Don't just identify something because you are only halfway there. I want you to go all the way and discuss all these different things, and be very mindful that this is for 30% of the mark. So if you want to think about how much detail should I put enough detail for 10 marks for each poem or thereabouts. And that is why I keep belaboring the point. I keep repeating this point of it's very important for you to select poems that speak to you on a personal level. So spend your time wisely, reading through poems, getting a sense of how does this poem make you feel? How does this poem relate back to the theme that you selected? And just enjoy this process of reading and therapy, in a sense, of just reading and enjoying and exploring different emotions. The final stage or step of the assignment, step 4, requires that you briefly describe a lesson that would relate to each poem. So each different poem will have a different lesson attached to it, and really the requirements of this is that you provide an overview of what you intend to teach and how this particular poem and the ideas of the poem can be integrated into a lesson. So it becomes a platform for a particular lesson, and you can be as creative as you want here. It's up to you how you best approach this, but we really want to encourage you to think of creative teaching strategies that are realistic and achievable. It's also very important that you do provide a description of the lesson, but be mindful that you don't have to provide it in great detail. It is not a lesson plan. You are just providing a summary or an overview of what you intend to do. So really just paint a kind of picture about the sort of lesson that you intend to teach and the teaching strategies that you will undertake. So this slide is just providing further details around responding to steps 1 and 2. So very important, like we've already stressed, that you select a quote or theme that speaks to you on a very personal level, and that you first unpack your interpretation of that theme or idea before you undertake analyzing the poems. Really what's important for this stage is that you explore your understanding of the message so that the marker has a framework of your understanding. It's very important that you are very purposeful in expressing how you view the theme and how this theme has basically inspired the selection of poems. The second point that I really want to raise, and this is very important, is that you always consider that whether the poem is age appropriate or not. And I think that there's 2 concerns here. So firstly, it's either that the poem is perhaps for a teenage or an adult audience, where there's perhaps very overt violence or overt ideas that will perhaps be too mature for the audience. But at the other end of the spectrum, we also don't want to select poems that are too immature for the audience. So you really have to get a happy medium here. I'm not saying that you shouldn't tackle difficult themes and ideas, but do it in a child-friendly way. I think the beauty of a poem that is created for a child is that it provides this very open space for them to explore what they are going through, the emotions that they are likely to experience. And a lot of the times these are emotions that us as adults are disconnected from, or perhaps it's something that each one of us, our inner child, connects to. So be very mindful of these poems that you select. Make sure that it's not too mature and it's not too immature for a child. Obviously, we will also judge this age appropriateness on your substantiation. So be very mindful about the substantiation. However, if there are themes of overt violence that will likely traumatize the child, then you will obviously be penalized for that. So be very mindful that when you are tackling these sometimes more difficult topics, which some of you might embrace and some of you might stay clear of, that you really choose poems that were created for a child to explore these ideas. So essentially it's a poem that's written in a child-friendly manner to explore sometimes these adult themes and ideas. And you will, the more you read through poems, you will be able to distinguish between different types of adult and childlike poems. So it's also very important that you choose poems that expand your learners intellectually and emotionally. And this is where it's very important for you to not underestimate the capabilities of a child, but also don't overestimate them. I think, choose something that you as a teacher can further explore and unpack, but it's something that educates rather than traumatizes the child. As much as many of these poems can deal with very painful emotions and ideas, and it's important for us to provide a space to normalize these emotions. We never want to purposefully traumatize a child, and we always want them to explore these sometimes uncomfortable themes and ideas in a way that makes them feel comfortable, not in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable, because then we are just actually creating another issue around censorship. But this will be unpacked in a lot more detail, this idea of censorship and what you can and can't say, and who gets to decide that within children's literature. But for now, I want you to just be purposeful about the poems that you select and to substantiate your selection and explain your reasoning and rationale. We will really be looking at this because we really want you to have been very thoughtful in these particular steps and stages of the assignment. So step 3 in the assignment requires the discussion or analysis of the poem. Remember to consider the language and overall meaning of the poems. It's also a good idea for you to look at the poetic devices that have been used, but very important that you don't just state, like we have already been discussing in lectures, that you don't just identify the poetic devices, but you actually take it a step further. So you're looking at the poetic devices and you are saying why this is meaningful and how this links to the theme and feel and emotions of the poem. So really unpacking and discussing it. It's not just sufficient to identify these poetic devices. You can identify them, but you take it one step further. So you're identifying these, but you are looking at the whole poem. You are saying, how does this metaphor contribute to the feeling of the poem? And that's where your analysis is very important. It's not enough to just identify poetic devices. You are looking at the poem as a whole. So be mindful of that. You're looking at the poem as a whole, and there is obviously quite a lot you can say for this. but be mindful of the theme and ideas and messages of the poem, and to remember to substantiate these arguments with examples and ideas directly from the poem. You can refer to line numbers here, and also from your independent readings. So what we're really looking at here is an overview or an analysis of the poem as a whole. So it's important for you to look at the poetic devices and language of the poem and all of that, but it's not sufficient to just identify them. You are actually looking at how it contributes to the poem as a whole. So you must always go that one step further. And once again, be mindful of the mark allocation. I think a lot of the times students tend to spend too much time with this. Be guided by the assessment standards and the requirements in the marking rubric, and come back to this whole idea of providing an overview. So you're looking at the themes, you're looking at the ideas of the poem, how the poem has been structured, the rhyme, the rhythm, all of these poetic elements and poetic devices, and you are thinking about how this relates back to the theme that you've chosen. So always keep your theme in mind. Always be mindful of that theme or focus throughout this assignment. And as much as we are discussing different steps, this must be structured into an integrated essay. So be mindful of this, and if you need any reminder about essay structures, go back to your academic literacy. As much as this is a very creative assignment, obviously those skills that you developed in academic literacy for creating a essay will be very helpful within this assignment as well. So I won't elaborate too much more on this particular step because I think I have belabored the point, but really important for you to try to think outside the box and consider how poetry can be used as a creative platform for a wide variety of lessons. I think a lot of the times we see poetry as just a part of English, but in actual fact, it can be integrated into a wide variety of lessons. So consider this and think how poetry can be the starting point for anything from a mathematics lesson to a physical education lesson to a life sciences lesson. Anything, it's really just dependent on the theme and ideas of the poem and how that might relate to a very interesting idea or be a foundation for a really interesting learning activity or exercise activity. So be very mindful of this. Keep coming back to what is your theme, what is the idea, what is your focus in this assignment, and how does this particular poem meet that focus, and how might you then integrate it within a future classroom. For this particular slide, I just wanted to provide a brief overview around the assessment criteria. So I think many of us forget that the marking rubric is very important when you are editing your work and before you submit it. It's very important for you to look through the assessment criteria. So essentially what this does is provides an overview of the assessment standards, and obviously this is what us as markers will be marking your work from. So essentially you have exactly what we will be looking for, and you need to then submit your assignment knowing that you have met the specific criteria. And be very mindful about what are your particular goals that you've set for this assignment. What mark are you wanting to achieve? If you are wanting to achieve a first or an A, then you need to look at those assessment criteria. You need to look at the assessment standards and learning outcomes, and you need to then decide, do you think you have sufficiently met this? Obviously, it will be up to the marker to decide whether you have or not, but we will be using this as a baseline. So please be mindful that you achieve all of these assessment standards. And please be mindful of the mark allocation. The mark allocation indicates how much detail you should create, or how much detail you should provide for each of the assessment criteria. So for instance, the first assessment criteria we have here is the analysis of poems, and that is 30% of your mark. Obviously, this is weighted for slightly more than the other assessment criteria, as there is a lot to analyze within the poem, and this relates directly to the selected theme that you've chosen and your interpretation of that theme. We will be looking for your creativity here, but it's very important for you to explore the poems in a very real and meaningful manner. But be mindful that this is only 30%. I think you can sometimes get quite carried away with the analysis, but be mindful that you are analyzing the poem as a whole. You're looking at all the various poetic devices, the language of the poem, the rhyme, the rhythm, but you are looking at how it relates back to the overall theme and message of the poem, and how this theme and message relates back to your interpretation of the theme. So there is a lot that you can say, but be mindful that we are looking for quality responses. So quality over quantity is always something that you should focus on. So keep it concise, try not be very long-winded about it, but be very mindful that you are explaining and rationalizing your interpretation of the theme and your interpretation of the poem. I think the rest of the assessment criteria is quite standard, so please be mindful of each of the requirements and criteria. So really what we do is when we are marking, we even get to a point where some lecturers, I'll tell them to underline the descriptors, underline the key points that we have framed in here, and because really, if for instance, I think that there are many grammatical errors and understanding is affected a part of your assignment, then you will be immediately put in that lower end of the category. So be very mindful of this, because this marking rubric provides you with a direct overview of our expectation as markers. And this is what we will be marking. This is basically like our memorandum to mark your work. So be very mindful that you have achieved each one of these, and give yourself time to edit and rework. You do have time now. There's still a month to go for this assignment, so please don't underestimate. This assignment will take you a long time to get done, but our hope is that it's obviously an enjoyable process that will hopefully provide you with some inspiration for lessons that you can integrate into your teaching practice classrooms, or integrate into your classrooms one day when you are a teacher and you are standing in front of a very real audience. That is obviously our hope and intention. So this slide provides with some final thoughts from the assignment. This is also taken directly from our assessment guide. So the assignment should be presented in approximately 3 to 4 page essay. So be mindful that you are structuring this into an essay. As much as these different parts or phases of the assignment, it should be constructed into an integrated essay, meaning that there is obviously an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Be very mindful of the skills that you have already developed in academic literacy. You will be applying a lot of those skills within this particular essay-based assignment. As I have already mentioned, you will not be permitted to use any poems from lectures. The reason why we've decided this is because part of the requirement or learning outcome of the assignment is that you should be able to select your own quality poems. So you selecting poems from lectures is not meeting the assessment standards for this particular task. So it's very important that you choose your own poems, but you are more than welcome to select poems from similar poets, so poets that we've looked at in the lecture space and the classroom space. You are welcome to utilize that, and you're welcome to use the poems that we have already interrogated in class together and analyzed together as a starting point or an inspiration for the kind of poems that you believe speak to you, and poems that you feel particularly passionate about. And I think that that is also one tip that I'd love to give you. Choose poems that you really enjoy, that poems that speak to you, your passion for this poem, and the ideas that are maybe expressed will shine through and hopefully will result in you actually enjoying this assignment. Okay, also very important that you do not reference your lecture notes. Lecture notes are always considered secondary sources and not primary resources. But once again, use your lecture notes as a starting point, as a foundation for this assignment. All of the activities that we have already completed in lectures and activities that you will be completing independently online, they're all designed to help practice or model the skills that this assignment will be based on. So please be mindful of this. Go back to your lecture notes, go back to the discussions we had, reflect on these discussions, and once again, make it personally relevant. Okay, so finally, the essay component of this assignment should be well below 20% from a Turnitin perspective. And this is because this part of your assignment should be your original ideas. It should be your own interpretation and unpacking and explaining the theme and how this theme relates to the particular poem. We are mindful that obviously the system will pick up your selected poems as being plagiarized, and we have the authority and rights to deselect some areas. So please do not be worried if you have a particularly high Turnitin percentage, and that's mainly being flagged by the poems that you selected, which you've attached at the end of the assignment as appendix pages. But please be mindful that we are able to see where Turnitin is picking up your similarity or plagiarism percentage. So we are aware that we can deselect certain areas, but the bulk of your assignment, the bulk of your discussion should be your own original ideas. Thus, the essay component, your discussion, the plagiarism percentage or similarity percentage here should be very low because it should really be your interpretation. So please be mindful of this, and once again, please note that we will be looking at the poem as a whole, your assignment as a whole, and we will not mark your assignment if it is the Turnitin percentage is too high. We will look on a case-by-case basis. Okay, and I think all that's left to add is good luck with this assignment and enjoy this assignment. Please take your time with this assignment, and if you do have any further queries, concerns, or questions, please would you post them into your group related forum. Thank you so much for getting this far in this video tutorial. I know it is quite a long video tutorial, but I really hope that you have found it useful. Good luck and happy reading.